Welcome to the Unlist. Today we are talking about the shape of things to come. Now, some of you out there who are well versed in classic science fiction will get the reference of this video's title. Those of you who don't really dabble in stuff like that, understand. As it pertains to the subject of the video, the shape of things to come is talking about what I think is going to happen with the fragrance market as a whole, moving through the rest of the 2020s into the 2030s. So, before we can talk about what's to come, let's briefly recap what is, okay? So, for some of you right now, it may seem like we are in the absolute worst, abscessed pits of despair when it comes to the fragrance market. And there is evidence pointing towards that being the case, depending on what kind of perfumes you like to buy. We've watched the variety of our designer fragrances vastly dwindle down to a half dozen or so various tropes for each side of the gender aisle, male, female. So it's like the days of having Baskin-Robbins 31 flavors of fragrance for you to choose from are gone. Now it's just different brands presenting the same 6 flavors, more or less. And every year, brands come out with another slight deviation of a well-worn theme. So some of these themes actually stretch back 30, 40 years, mind you. So it's not like we are seeing this as a recent thing. It's just become more distilled in recent years, you know, from the aquatics to the post-aquatics, the gourmands, really transmutating into the bubblegum shower gel, heavy fruit amber chuli stuff. You know what I'm saying, right? All the fake ouds that came out of the woody ambers of the 2000s. Everything now that either smells like Aventus or BR 540 or Bleu de Chanel or one of the various Armani flavors, like a lot of women's fragrances these days are copying those or copying one of the more popular Dior's. And it just kind of goes like that, ad infinitum, ad nauseum. Now, on the other side of things, if you go off the beaten path and you start playing around with more boutique brands and niche brands, you find that they too are starting to have more of a homogenized feel to them. They feel almost homologated for a competition, so they all have to conform to a standardized spec in order to pass muster so they can compete with each other. If you don't know what homologation is, you're not a car guy, that's okay. You can look it up. But the analogy fits here. So you launch a niche brand, a brand new niche brand, and instantly you have 6 different standard flavors that you're expected to have. You have your typical, again, your Aventus smell alike, your BR 540 smell alike. You have the candy rose somewhere in there. You have the rose oud in there somewhere. You have some kind of, white floral sweet nonsense in there too. Something that's very, very sort of soapy clean, yada, yada, yada. You know, you might have a musk in there, but the musk is going to be a white musk. It's not going to be anything animalic, clearly. And it just kind of goes like that, you know? And then a lot of these streams get crossed into the designer space. So you will see sometimes the designer and the niche brands almost blur distinction with each other. It really just comes down now to price points. Price points, you know, with Tom Ford fragrances all costing $200 a piece, which is right around where Diptyque sits. Chanel is trying to follow that up to into that price space. A lot of the other major players, Dior, YSL, Armani, Hermes, they're all cranking out fragrances that are on the north side of the $100 demarcation line. So now it's like your base entry level designer fragrance might be $130. Whereas 4 or 5 years ago it was on the south side of the $100 line, so we're talking 85, 90 bucks. My bottle of Bleu de Chanel, when I bought it, was $90. $90 with tax, $99 with 10% sales tax in Washington. Nowadays, it's $130 before we even get to taxes. So it is literally $40 more expensive. It is almost half again as much as it was when I bought it for absolutely no reason. Now, that is really more to do with where things are going than where things are. So I will save that conversation for a little later. We're still talking about where things are, okay? So if you're someone who is in the fragrance space and you want more unique, more artistic, more challenging, things that feel more like the classic fragrances that a lot of your vintage enthusiasts will constantly pound the gavel of how much better things used to be 50, 60 years ago, da-da-da-da-da. And I'm like, there is some truth to that. And the truth to that really comes down to the budgets and time that used to be spent on fragrances while being sold for much less. So the fragrances weren't getting the margin they get now. And that's mainly because the fragrances were used as a foot in the door kind of fragrance. They were willing to take either a loss or a break even on the perfumes a long time ago, back when your granddad and your dad was wearing perfumes, because the hope was by putting all of their effort to make a really interesting, exciting, noteworthy fragrance that would turn heads would be rewarded, because you'd buy that fragrance and you'd make some money on it, right? They wouldn't break loss on it, but then you would turn around and get a pair of gloves. You might grab a hat, a shirt, something. The fragrance was the get your foot in the door, so you'd buy everything else. But as the income inequality grew into the 80s and wages stopped keeping up with prices, and I don't want to make this a political video, but you get where I'm going here, right? You get where I'm going. You lived through those decades, you know. Don't need me to tell you. A switch kind of flipped, and suddenly all of those ready-to-wear items, the underwear, the socks, the shoes, the jeans, they were now hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars. They were out of reach. So the average person wasn't buying that stuff anymore. They were just buying the perfume, because all they could afford was the perfume. So suddenly, the volume had to be made up somewhere, which is where the cost cutting came in to increase the margins. That's where all the research and development into creating fragrances that were more mass appealing, that could get larger numbers of people who may not normally wear a fragrance to buy one. So all of that cool, dangerous, risque stuff went away, got discontinued. All of those materials that cost a lot of money were reformulated out. And then, of course, restrictions from regulations plays a part. I don't want to dismiss IFRA and stuff like that. That also had a part to play, but I want to tell you that those regulations have a smaller part to play than what you really think. People can and do still make fragrances that smell like they did 40, 50 years ago. It's just nowadays they have to go about it differently. So it's not necessarily more expensive either. They just don't want to do it because it doesn't sell. What sells is what we have now on the shelves, right? Right. So that leads us back to where things are now, right? We've come full circle. And let's talk about where things are going. Okay, let's do that. We are 9 minutes in. We've had our recap. Let's get cracking. So, from my observation over the last 20 or so years, leading up into really the last 4 years since the pandemic, right, I have noticed that things have kind of sped up a lot with the fragrance industry as a whole. So, releases are more frequent. Less time and less money are spent on releases. Less risk is taken on the releases. And a lot of that has to do with the long-term views replaced with the typical corporate goal, sociopathic, world-destroying capitalist view, right? The typical shareholder capitalism view of everything has to keep growing, end over end, year over year. It has to be this continuous growth, and it can't be slow growth. It has to be tremendous exponential growth every year, like a cancer, like a virus, like an amoeba. And if it's not doing that, if it's not growing at that rapid pace every year, then it's time to dump it. It's time to sell it off, right? If it's not making us fast cash, if it's not making gods of mere mortals, if it's not turning people into kings, not making them disgustingly rich in a short period of time, then they're unhappy. And it has to be broken down, pieced out, piecemeal, or it has to be flipped and some other sucker with high hopes and, aspirations, but not willing to play the game, right? They get to be the unlucky purchaser of that brand, I suppose. That's the idea. It's all about pump and dump. That is a phrase you should get very, very familiar with, because that is the future, at least the short-term future. I have an idea of the long-term future too, but again, hold that thought. We'll get into that in a second. But the short-term future is we're going to watch this continuous race to the bottom to find that lowest common denominator, that one-size-fits-all fragrance that costs a penny to make and sells for $300. That somehow people are going to be willing to afford in this economy. Don't ask me how that's going to happen. How someone's going to buy 1 cent worth of fragrance oil in a glass bottle that sells for $300 and be happy with that. I don't know where they get these unrealistic expectations from, but that's where we're headed. We're racing to that point. That convergence is what we're racing towards. And unfortunately, along the way, we will see continued casualties. We've already seen, and I've explained this in past videos, we've already experienced the death of the entry-level fragrance, right? We don't have the Codys and the Schultons and those around anymore. Avon is all but extinct in the U.S. It still does well in third world countries and struggling economies and places where the money doesn't go as far. So anywhere that people can't have as much purchasing power, brands like Avon can still make money, because for people like that, Avon is a luxury. For people like that, Avon is Chanel for all intents and purposes. So they do very well down there. But up here, where people have this much money, but this much standards, the usual champagne taste on a beer budget, right? People who have that kind of mindset, they're not buying the Avons. So that stuff went away because we didn't want it anymore. It's not necessarily like it was taken from us. We didn't want it anymore, right? So we wanted to scrape by and eat ramen noodles 5 nights a week so we could afford a bottle of Chanel. We wanted to do that. We had this weird, and particularly in the United States, maybe not to the same extent in Europe. Okay, Europe's a bit of a different animal. Europe kind of really has its own thing going on. But in the United States, we have this idea that you can't really be an individual unless you have a lot of money. If you wear a uniform and have a regulation haircut, all that stuff, because you're in the working class, you're in the working poor, you can't really step out of that and have long hair, crazy colored hair, tattoos and piercings, because you're either filthy rich, so you don't care anymore, right? Or you're a degenerate. It's one of those two. Either you're a hippie loser, a bohemian, or you're someone that's got enough money that you no longer apply yourself to society's standards. So anything that's artistic, anything that's individualistic, anything that says, I have taste, is typically shunned by people of middle and lower incomes. They want the white walls. They want the mayonnaise on the sandwich. They want the Toyota Camry in the driveway, because that feels safe to them. That feels successful to them. They feel like they can't have the flaming red sports car. They can't have the crazy oud perfume. They can't have the extravagant low-cut jeans or the haircut that goes down their back, tied in the braids. They can't have that unless they're rocking that $4 million home and whatever, playing the stock market, work from home, eating artisanal food every night. That's when they can have that kind of look about them, when they can move into that more individualistic, like they have to earn that or something. And that's the thing I've never really been able to meet on even terms. I've never been able to make my peace with that concept myself. Now, I know I have a very regulation appearance too. I used to have long hair and crazy clothes, but maybe part of me just gave up and conformed because I need a paycheck too. But just from a mental standpoint, I've always had cognitive dissonance myself, right? about that, about me doing this to make money, but then me not really sitting well with the idea of me having to do this. So I have my own cognitive dissonance, like the past video I made about this whole concept of you having to look like an android, and therefore smell like an android in order to be accepted. Now, at least with that, I don't. I just wear whatever the hell I want to wear, but I also have the luxury of being by myself at my job. No one's looking over my shoulder and wondering why I smell like civet. They're not doing that. So I can smell like however I want. Not everyone is that fortunate, though. So I do need to acknowledge that in the room. So, you know, all of the so-called individuality and all of the so-called taste and everything and curation and sophistication has all gone up market. Up, 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 up. You have to pay now if you want to smell like a classic fougere or a chypre, or you want to smell like incense or something like that, or a high-quality floral. You've got to pay to play that game. Otherwise, it's bubblegum shower gel for you all day, every day, and just deal with it. That's what you get because you're a poor person. That's what you get, right? That's what the AI and all the marketing gurus and all of that stuff, the chat GPT bots has determined you get stuck with. It's very dystopian and it sucks. But that's where we're headed. Europe is a bit of a different animal because in general, as I said, in general, Europe has a more progressive outlook culturally. Europe has also had perfume for a lot longer than the US, Canada, and Mexico have had. So Europe doesn't have that sort of conformist mentality. You know, you've got young people still wearing Chanel No. 5, and young people still wearing Shalimar and Pour Un Homme de Caron, and still wearing Eau Sauvage and not caring. Still wearing the big, heavy oud, incense, rose perfumes. Actually, in Europe, that stuff has gotten really popular. A lot of people in Europe love those heavy Middle Eastern fragrances. They've come into fashion over there. Over here, not so much. Like I said, we all still want our blues and our pinks and all that BS. It's what we're stuck on. We have been stuck on that since the 80s, honestly. And I mentioned to someone else I had a conversation with that America got stuck on that stuff because it was that stuff that really gained widespread acceptance to wear perfume in the first place. It wasn't normal for guys to wear perfume every day for every occasion up until the 80s. You had the cologne guys in the 70s who did what they wanted, right, and got made fun of for it. But for the average Joe to just wear a fragrance every day as part of his normal routine, that really wasn't a thing until the 80s. And it's because of a lot of fresh, sort of easygoing fragrances that made it safe to do that. And we've just been stuck there ever since. 40 years later, we're still stuck there on that. We're still stuck on stupid. Now, where are things going in the long term? Well, here's where I talk about the long term. That race to the bottom has to come to an end sooner or later, right? Because they reach the bottom, right? That's how that works. They reach the bottom. So the bottom falls out. The proverbial bottom falls out. Well, right now, we see a lot of venture capitalist firms, a lot of big investment groups. I call them vulture capitalists because they are just predators. The whole pump and dump thing I mentioned earlier, that's where that comes from. So if not for corporate consolidation, you know, L'Oreal and LVMH and Coty and those groups, right? Lauder Group. Outside of them are the private capital investment people, the Cerberus, the BlackRocks, that whole thing. And they are buying up a bunch of these perfume houses too. And all of them have the same thing in mind. Buy up all these brands, have them launch a blitzkrieg of perfumes, just 20 new fragrances every year, just litter the market. They all have to have familiar themes. They all have to have some stupid marketing gimmick about being expensive and exclusive and high quality materials. Mind Games is a perfect example of that. Mind Games is a line owned by Neiman Marcus, and they all smell like absolute Bath & Body Works garbage, but they sell for $400 a fucking bottle. And it's because Neiman Marcus thinks they're going to pump and dump that line in a couple of years. So, and then DS and Durga's gotten bought up, Parfum de Marly's gotten bought up, da-da-da-da-da, on and on it goes. And then all these new brands that continue to launch every single year, a lot of them come from Middle Eastern investments. They come from princes. They come from oil magnates, Russian oligarchs, you name it, even people in the Italian mafia, all right? Anybody with a lot of money. Anyone with a lot of money that wants to launder that money, right? They launch a fragrance brand, then the capitalists come in and buy it up. That's the dump. They start the brand, that's the pump. Launder the money, here's the brand. Capitalist swoops in, picks it up like, a predator grabbing a small animal and flying off with it. That's the dump. Then once the big vulture capitalist has grabbed the thing and flown off with it, they continue to invest in it to try and make it grow, right? They want it to get bigger and fatter and make them a bunch of money. And then once they've done that, within a year or two time, they've made their money back on their investment. Then it's time to dump it again. And this time, they dump it in someone's lap who's going to burn, go down with the ship, So that's the whole idea, is earn a bunch of money on it and then make it someone else's problem. Earn a bunch of money on it, make it someone else's problem. Problem with that is, as income inequality continues to increase, especially in the West and particularly in the UK, the United States, a lot of Anglophone countries are having this problem more so than other parts of the West. But English speakers seem to be feeling the crunch more than anywhere else. Don't know why that is. I'm not in good with geopolitics or economy, but it seems like UK, US, Canada, we're the ones that have all the big millionaire woes and all the poor people living in trailers and stuff, right? So as that continues to worsen and less people are buying perfume, even those middle brands, right, the Chanels, the Diors, the YSLs, the middle brands will continue to try and go up market to follow the money. But the problem is you can't have a pyramid like that where all the brands are at the top. So you've got designers and niche and luxury brands, and everyone is fighting for the same tiny group of people. They're all $300, $400, $500 bottles now, right? Let's project this out 3 or 4 or 5 years. All the perfumes are now $1,000. They're all $1,000, and they're all really doing the same thing, and they're all chasing the same tiny, tight-knit group of millionaires and multimillionaires and billionaires. That's not sustainable. I mean, then you see a crash, right? It's a bubble. Bubbles burst. We've seen housing bubbles burst. We've seen automotive bubbles burst. We've seen stuff happen all throughout history. It just goes like this in a cycle. The tulip, right? You guys ever heard of the whole tulip scare? It's going to be that, the tulip scare. That's an old term. You can look that up and learn about that yourself. But the whole tulip panic, tulip scare, in like the Renaissance period, that's going to happen. And when that happens, all of those brands are going to fall back down to earth, end up in discounters, end up in liquidators, and suddenly a lot of these middle brands are going to have to also readjust their pricing, readjust their market footprint, put things back at a more reasonable price because they don't want to go out of business. So they have to eat crow and lower their prices. It's already happened in the past, guys. Chanel alone has gone into drugstores twice. They went into drugstores in the 50s because it was a big economic downturn immediately after World War II. And then they went back in drugstores again in the 70s because we had the oil embargo, right? So all the world, the United States and Europe, was getting gas price gouged. So both times that affected the luxury market, and both times Chanel had to go into drugstores and be a drugstore brand for a handful of years. My mother bought her first bottles of Chanel in a drugstore. Eventually things reverse course and go back up again, right? But that happens, and we are due for that. And that right there, plus a sort of re-equalization between entry-level and mid-tier and high-end, that's going to happen. When that reset button hits, things may look more like they did 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Just got to ride it out. That is the shape of things to come.